Good afternoon and welcome back to Coffee Talk. This Coffee Talk is dedicated to the zechut of the refuah shelema of Esther bat Yocheved by her friend and the refuah shelema of Sylvia bat Rivkah by her granddaughter. We are in middle of a conversation. Hold on a second. There's something off with my volume over here. That is a continuation of this concept of tikkun hamidot, the idea of spending time and elevating our character traits. And we spoke about the idea of sensitizing ourselves, creating a situation where we are able to think a little bit more deeply about who we are as individuals, recognize our strengths, recognize our weaknesses, and then come up with a plan that allows us to express the best version of ourselves. And I say this to everybody. If you are living a life where you feel like you are okay and everything is good, if you feel or if you believe that you don't need to improve, to work on yourself in any way, my friends, I have bad news for you. You are going backwards, okay? That the only way in life that we can find true meaning and express the best version of ourselves is if we have a clear vision with avodah, with a work schedule that helps us become more. This is true for anything. For those of you that are in relationships, marriages, okay, family, you want to improve your relationships. If you're not working on improving, making better, perfecting almost those relationships, you are in fact somewhat responsible for doing the opposite. Because the world around us is always moving forward, there's always progress. And if we think that we could lean on our natural talents to get by all the relationships that you and I try to manage without there being a real system of development and growth, you're probably going to end up making lots of mistakes. So this is I have a source sheet out there in front of for you. If you're not here and you're watching and you want the source sheet, I'll send it to you afterwards. I can't do it right now. But we're gonna start like this. Anava is humility. Okay, humility is a fascinating midah. I would argue probably the most important midah. Now, that's one of the reasons why God picked Moshe. But remember that when we speak about humility, we're always using the golden means of every midah, which means that every midah, every trait can express itself to an extreme. And when I think of humility, I'm not thinking about the extreme or any extreme of humility. I'm thinking about that place called tiferet, the balance, the harmony of the midah itself. Because there are plenty of people who are very patient, and they're very annoying because you don't get a reaction out of them, right? And you want there to be. There are times where impatience is actually a good thing, depending on the circumstance. And therefore, when we're talking about all of these traits, we're talking about these midot. The question is, well, what is that golden mean look like? What am I aiming for? If we really want to improve on anivut in our lives, well, what does that look like? And that's what we're going to try to do together today. Okay? So this is what he said. This is a quote from Rabbi Reuven in Cheshbon HaNefesh. He says as follows. He says like this. He says, man finds his delights in examining his own virtues, in discovering even the smallest of his positive attributes, in the most minute faults of his friends. For he can then find reason to be proud even when accompany the great ones whose little fingers are thicker than his loins. In a nutshell, it's much more amusing to you and I to recognize the chisronot of the other people so I could feel like I'm a bigger person. Oh, I'm not so bad. That person, 100%, we're always seeing the end of it. Why? Because you and I don't have the ability of seeing the totality of truth. There's a concept in called ayin hara, right? You've heard this before, right? And ayin hara, we know what that is, the evil eye. We have our chamsas up, chamsa. We have our, all of our sigulot to protect us, the red string some people are wearing, all kinds of interesting things that we do to protect ourselves from this evil eye. But it's interesting that the evil eye, the yetzer hara, right? The evil eye, right? The ayin hara is written out in the singular, right? It's called ayin hara, the evil eye. Why isn't it called Einayim Harim? Why isn't it called the evil eyes? Why is it in the singular and not in the plural? Right? And the reason for this is because our Chachamim taught us that if you had both eyes open, you could never give someone an ayin hara. If you were able to see the whole entire picture, right? There's no way you could wish anything negative on someone. Seeing the whole picture is recognizing that person's, even though he may be benefiting from that, the money or the car or whatever it is that they have, if you had both eyes open, you'd see the flip side, the challenge that all of that comes with, the burden that all of that comes with. And therefore, when you and I are looking at anyone, we always be mindful that when we perceive things, we are only looking with one eye, not with both eyes open. It's in the singular. And therefore, it's easier for us to reconcile who we are as individuals because we are social creatures. It's much more easy for us to look at the chisronot of the people around us and make, okay, I don't have to work so hard. I'm okay. I'm doing much better than my friend is doing. I have a relationship, I have a job, I have a parnasa, I have a child, I have this, I have that. I'm doing great. I don't have to work on anything. I'm okay, and that's a mistake. What is the real benchmark for who you are supposed to be? How do we measure our success?
Based on how much further you come along than yesterday or last year. Ask yourself.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyah b'dvaro. It's coffee talk, but I'm having a tea right now. The idea is like this. It's true that we're supposed to be better than we were yesterday, but the measuring stick is measured based on my own potential. So I ask people, do you have a picture in your mind's eye of what it means to be the best version of yourself? What are the things that come natural to you? What are the things that are easy for you? Does that define who you are? Your natural talents? Or is it the places where you choose to excel and grow beyond the natural talents that define who you are?
What if you're happy where you are?
So you could say that. You should be happy with what you have, right? However, there should always be a desire to want a little bit more for yourself. There's a difference between when you think about the material world and yourself. You can be super grateful for everything that you have in your life, right? But when it comes to human development, it requires some kind of effort, struggle, intention to overcome for it to achieve a level of perfection.
What if you don't ask yourself that question?
So you're
not striving. I strive my whole life. I don't want to strive.
Right, you can say that again, but that means what you're really saying is that you're okay to settle. You want to settle. That's what you're saying. You're ready to settle. I'm done, and I want to settle. I hear that. I personally am. It's unsettling to me to want to settle, and it's because I'm a very big believer in pleasure and enjoying the highest levels of pleasure that this world has to offer. Why would I want to settle?
So this is about humility.
100%.
Let's say, okay, so you used to go, I'm happy.
Yeah.
I feel unhappy from where I am.
Yeah.
I'm satisfied, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why do I have to pursue more? Why do I have to ask for more? Isn't that kind of the opposite of humility?
We're going to define what humility is in a moment. It's a good question. It's a good point. We're going to get to it. So
There's a definition possibly between material and then your spiritual development.
Or 100%. When it comes to materialism,
It's tricky here.
It is very tricky.
It's like, am I going for things in life?
Right. I'm not speaking about materialism. I'm talking about your personal, spiritual. Even the word spiritual, I'm uncomfortable using, even though it's probably true. But for people who struggle with spirituality, I don't want them to say, well, I'm not a spiritual person, and therefore it's not for me. There's something called character, development. And we should always be wanting to be individuals that have a more refined character. No one ever reaches a point in their lives where I'm done with character development. There's always a higher level of refinement, always more patience, more understanding, more love, more giving, more chesed, more hakarat tov, more of it that we should be striving for. That should be an endless. And the reason why we strive for those things, by the way, just so it's clear, there's a concept in Kabbalah that the more something is alike to something else, the more similar it is. So, for example, if God is the greatest expression of chesed, the more involved I am involved in chesed, the more godly I become. If God is an expression of erech apayim, being slow to anger, then the more I am involved in being slow to anger, the more godly I become. And therefore, when I talk about my traits, I talk about refining my traits so I can become more godly. If I'm more godlike, I bring more godliness into the world. I bring more of what I call kedusha. These are all spiritual truths. The mistake that we make is that we often use materialism as a way of defining and measuring success. And I think this is a mistake. There are plenty of people that would much rather be poor than have the challenge of wealth, with all the challenge that wealth comes with. We don't fully appreciate the nuances, but they're there.
According to the Mishnah, you have money, you want matayim.
That's right. You're never satisfied. You're never satisfied with any material things that you have, 100%. Me'achuz. Okay, let's keep going. Let's try to define what it is that we're looking for over here in this concept of anivut. So Rabbi Bachya says as follows. He writes this in Chovot HaLevavot. He says, on what do virtues depend? All virtues and duties are dependent on humility. Therefore, all midot, the binyan of all of our midot, the building structure for the midot that we have, the character traits that we have, are very much dependent on this concept of anivut, humility. Look at the Gemara. Look what the Gemara says in Sanhedrin. He says as follows. He says, one who sacrifices a whole offering shall be rewarded for a whole offering. One who offers a burnt offering shall have the reward of a burnt offering. But one who offers humility to God, and man shall be rewarded with a reward as if he had offered all the sacrifices in the world, as it is written, a contrite and humbled spirit is a sacrifice to God. God does not ignore a broken heart. Now, humility is at the core of what the Gemara is saying, is at the core, more than anything else in the world you can give to God, more than the sacrifice and the charity, more than anything else in the world that you could possibly think of doing good. The greatest thing that you can possibly give is what? Humility. So what should your question be right now? Rabbi, I don't understand what that means. What is humility? Like, why is it so important?
You have to have a broken heart to be humble?
Do you have to have a broken heart to be humble? No.
That's what it says here.
That's what he says over here. God, it just says God does not ignore a broken heart. But a broken heart.
Why would a broken heart shouldn't be a contingency for that?
So what does a broken heart mean? A broken heart doesn't mean.
Not complete?
A broken heart means that there's a contrast between what I want to do for myself versus something greater, something outside of me that requires me to do something else. So the dugma, for example, let's say right now I really want to go to a basketball game, right? This is an amazing game. The Knicks are playing whoever, right? And I have a choice between going to the basketball game or helping old people who desperately need my help right now with heaters in the cold winter. So I've to go ahead and to break my heart and not going to the game, right? And versus it's the beginning part. It's the beginning stages of it. It's the beginning stages of it. I'm not saying that's the definition, but think of it in those terms. There's something called ratzon, my desire, right? And sometimes the desires that we want are not so good for us. There are other things. So when he's talking about a broken heart, he's not talking about someone who's depressed. He's talking about someone who's breaking his heart's desire for something bigger and greater. And we'll double click on it. We're going to get back to it. I'm not ignoring it. Okay, let's keep going. Rav Kook in the moral principle.
You can do both. You first go to the basketball game, and then you go to the old people's home.
Right. No. So Marie, in my scenario, there's never a third. There's only one or the other. Otherwise, it's not a good example. Right? It has to be something that is one or the other. Obviously, if you could do both, you should do both. But let's say you can't do both. How do you decide? Gotta do
You
one.
go to a basketball game. Because then you feel better.
You do feel better, but sometimes you feel even better by not going to the basketball game, knowing that you're helping 100 people with whatever it is that you're doing. Okay, again, I'm not suggesting that you should enjoy the world. Enjoy the world. Go eat steak, go to games, go and have fun, see the world. I'm not saying that you ignore the things you want to do. I'm talking about sometimes in life we have choices. That's all I'm saying. Okay, Rav Kook, in the moral principle, says humility is associated with spiritual perfection. When humility affects depression, it is defective. When it is genuine, it inspires joy, courage, and inner dignity. So true anivut is not depression. That's the wrong expression of humility. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something very, very different. We're talking about a humility that inspires courage, inner dignity, and joy. So what does that look like? The pasuk in Bamidbar says, very humble, number 4, more than any other man who went upon the face of the earth. I'm sorry, I'm missing a T over there, right? So we're talking about whom? Moshe, right? Moshe is the most humble man. Now, when you think of Moshe, was he a depressed person? When you think of Moses, okay, let me tell you, when I think of Moses, let me tell you what I think about. Okay, I think of Charlton
Not
Heston.
depressed at all.
I'm so sorry. It's just ingrained. It's ingrained. Yeah, unfortunately, it's been like forever branded in my mind. You know, he's the guy that I see, unfortunately, and but I don't think of a depressed man. I think of someone who has the courage to stand up to a powerful king, who has the courage to stand up to a people who are so complicated, to inspire them, to encourage them, to remove their fear, to get people to believe in him. That wasn't an easy feat. But yet somehow he was a humble man. When you think of Moses, you know that he's associated with humility because of the verse. But if I was looking at the story of who Moses is or was, I would not say that he's humble. There's nothing humble about him.
You seen and didn't listen?
Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't.
Yeah, there's lots of things about him that does define so the question is, when we speak as Jews of humility, well, what are we talking about? Now, I think I suspect that the reason why most of us have a hard time with the word is because when we think of humility, we often think of humiliation, to be humiliated. And that's our association with the word humble. And that's certainly not the Jewish definition of what humility is. And the proof in the pudding is Moses. Like, he's a guy who's going to war, picking up fights with these massive armies and winning, fighting kings, fighting individuals, squashing rebellions. Yeah.
Why do you say like Moshe wasn't like that? I mean, you said like he's not most humble.
I know. I said that if we were looking at the story itself, if I was telling you the story of who Moshe was, you would not assume that his midah was humility. You would tell me his midah is gvura. Gvura, like justice, the guy who's the lawgiver, who's telling you what to do, do this and don't do that. Like, I wouldn't think that his midah is humility. Like, he's the most humble man ever. Like, why is that the expression of his nature? Yeah.
It always seems, I mean, if you're looking at the background of the story about Moshe,
Right.
it always kind of never in it for any of the glory at all. Like, we never see him ever like in that exalted, I am, it was never that impression of
Right.
So it's like he had a constant fight within himself to like say, I'm asked to do this and I'm going to persevere and show up and do the work, do what's necessary.
Right. So Moses' greatness,
Never that I wanted this.
he's always overcoming his midah. It's interesting, when we meet Moses in the story, he wasn't a young man. He's 80 years old in the story when you meet him. He's 80 years old in the story when we meet him. Think about it. He dies, he lives till 120. He starts his journey. Now, it's interesting, if you had to pick someone to be the lawgiver, to be the redeemer, to be the man that goes out to battle, would you choose an 80-year-old man who had a lisp, who was to give over the oral law? So there's some of the reasons.
I like a list. Hey.
So what was I saying? So
I have a question.
yeah, go ahead. I'll take your question.
Moses was the most humble, and here you're talking about he does not ignore a broken heart. So one would say, and this could be, I don't know if my interpretation is correct. So basically, he gave up the end of his, from 80 to 120 to take the Jews out of Mitzrayim.
Yeah.
And then bring them to Israel.
Correct.
Okay, so he gave up any desire or any safety that he personally had.
Okay.
Okay, for a mission for Hashem,
Correct.
right? And he completed that. That was his goal, to complete.
Well, he didn't complete it. He failed.
No, once he got them right to the border.
He failed. His goal was to bring the Jewish people into the land of Israel. And
But I have a question.
everyone that he knew died by the time they got there.
With the next generation.
He failed in that respect. Yeah, go on. Yeah, so.
So, but he didn't have a good relationship with the people. It was Aaron who had the good relationship.
But that's something else. Meaning, like, it's true that Aaron was it was much more than that. It's okay. This is a tangent, but it's definitely worth expressing right now. Mechila. So there's Aharon represents. He's the priest. He's the high priest. He represents the relationship between man and God. Right? Now, isn't that what Moses was doing also? Right? But the difference is that Moses didn't have a title. He was just a Navi. That's a title that anyone can have. That's later. That's more of a description of who he was. But that's not his title. His title was Navi. He was Navi. Rabbeinu. He was our teacher. That's his title, you could say. Okay? He was our teacher. There's lots of teachers. Technically, right now, unfortunately, or for better for worse, I'm your teacher, right? So the idea is that you have this great guy named Moses, who's a teacher, and then you have his brother Aaron, who is this priest, right? Moses is the guy who literally brings God down from a spiritual plane into a physical world and introduces him to humanity. And now Aaron's job is to maintain that relationship. His job is a little different because of his title. Because of the uniform that he wears, he has special clothing, he has the choshen, he has the tzitz, he has his cloak, he has his begeds, it's mitznefet, he has all these different layers of clothing that when you see him, whoa, he's a different kind of guy, he's a priest. Aaron's job was to maintain this deep relation with humanity because his job was to draw people up to God. Moses brought God down to man. They couldn't understand him. Aaron's job was to elevate man to God. His job was to be relatable. Different missions, okay? But as far as this conversation is concerned, Moses' uniqueness is that he had accomplished so much, but there was truly nothing there of his own. The book that he brought down is not his own. He didn't write it. He made some commentaries on it, asking God to change some letters and add some things here and there. V'yikra, the smaller aleph, we'll see that in a couple of weeks. Right? He did not interpret. Moses does not have any interpretation. All the Torah Shebaal Peh is what he received from God. All he is a conduit between God and man. All of it. That's huge. Yes, that's it. That was his role. For 40 years, all he was doing was communicating God's will to the people. That's it. You have the written Torah. He gave that to the Jewish people, and then he also, in addition to that, gave us the oral Torah as well. Yeah.
But Aaron could never have then accomplished that level of having that, being who he was as a priest, if that other piece never happened.
Of course not.
So it's a connector.
Of course not. But remember that sometimes a leader has to sacrifice so much for the greater good. So the people, they say that Moses had a Karen Or. He had horns of light coming at him, and they were afraid of him. When he came down from Har Sinai, he wore a mask. He was hooded. People could not relate to him. They grew terrified of Moses. When you think of a terrifying, frightening person, do you think of a humble person? Think about that for a minute. Think about the sight for a second. Stop for a second. Stop your imagination for just walk with me. When you think of someone humble, what image comes in your mind? Do you think of a guy who's like Arnold Schwarzenegger with muscles popping out, who's standing on the side of a cliff in the Superman pose? Or do you think of a man who's kind of like hunched over in the corner with a book saying Tehillim?
Because we think of humiliation, as you said.
Exactly. That's my point. And if we're having a conversation today about Middot, then we have to clarify what it is. So Moses is this humble man. He is the expression of humility. And therefore, when we think of Moses, make sure you have a clear picture. You're talking about an elderly guy in his 80s, but back then people didn't age the same way. He was super strong, okay? He was a powerful person. He had a lot of his own personal issues that he had to overcome. He refined himself to the point where God was able to rest his spirit on him and use him as a conduit to bring his ratzon, his will to the people, God's will to the people.
He didn't want to.
It's true. He didn't want to. That's true. That was that initial step of anivut. But by the way, there he was punished for it a little bit, right? He said, God says to Moses, "I want you to take this job." He says, "Who am I?" He says, "Okay, what are the signs?" Okay, he gave him the tzarat When he put his hand inside his cloak and pulled it out, and he had leprosy, that was a punishment to experience leprosy in his hand. He was punished because of the anivut. That's the Torah's expression of that's false anivut. That when God reaches out to you and says, "Hey, you're the guy for the job," you don't say, "No, thank you." No, thank you. He's the creator, the master of the universe. He knows better. You're gonna tell him no? He's punished for it. That's false anivut.
So what is humility? Self-sacrifice?
No, we're gonna get there. Don't fast forward. We're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. Let's keep going. I wanna keep moving. Okay, people on Zoom, I'm just warning you that my battery at my computer is at 14%. I think we should be okay for the next 25 minutes, but I'm just warning you, if it does shut off in Middot, it wasn't me canceling anything, it was my computer dying. Okay, so
Don't you have a charger?
unfortunately I don't have one here. But we'll be fine. Don't worry, Marie, I will make sure the class ends before the battery dies. Okay, fine. So we're at number 5. King David says, the arrogance cannot stand in your presence. You hate all who do wrong. Arrogance is the opposite of anivut, the extreme opposite. Let's go to number 6, Rabbi Raphael of Barshad. He says, when I get to heaven, they're going to ask me, why didn't you learn more Torah? And I will tell them that I wasn't bright enough. Then they're going to ask me, why didn't you do more kind deeds for others? And I will tell them that I was physically weak. Then they're going to ask me, why didn't you give more to charity? And I'll tell them that I didn't have enough money for that. And then they're going to ask me, if you were so stupid, weak, and poor, why were you so arrogant? And for that, I won't have an answer. The Gemara in Gittin tells a famous story of the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas. And the Gemara blames him, says that he caused the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. They blame him for the whole destruction of the temple, the first temple. Do you know the story? In a nutshell, his story was what? The what? Shema? Hulo Yishim. He basically was, there was a famous story, remember the famous story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? Right? So this rabbi was the rabbi. So Bar Kamsa went to the Romans and said, listen, you know what? The Jews are revolting against you. What did he do? He brought an animal, a lamb, cut a little bit under the eyelid, which would invalidate that offering as an offering. And they brought it to Rabbi Avkila, said, listen, the Romans want to bring this as a sacrifice. So he's like, listen, we can't do it because we can't offer this as a sacrifice because if we do, people are going to learn that you can bring an animal with a blemish on it. And therefore he denied it. And because of this, the Romans saw this as a sign of the Jews rebelling against. Now everyone knew what was happening. It wasn't like he wasn't aware. He was fully cognizant that this was a whole ploy. He was aware. And therefore, for the sake of shalom, he should have allowed it. He should have allowed it, but he didn't. The Gemara says the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkila caused the loss of our home, the burning of our sanctuary, and our exile from our land. He should have stood up. He should have done something. He should have allowed this sacrifice to be offered on the altar for the sake of peace. But he didn't because of his humility. I wasn't willing to challenge the sources. I wasn't willing to challenge what we typically do because of the circumstance that I was in right now. He should have challenged, but he didn't.
But this isn't the same as Moshe because Moshe challenged Hashem.
Right. It's different. There's different gradients of humility. There's not just one standard humility. There's different.
And it just seems like it's a different midah.
No, it's the same midah.
I don't understand the nature of.
I'm gonna get you there.
If an animal has upon it like a blemish or something that was from natural causes, but if he knew that this was one that was put upon the animal to make it not be permissible, possibly, he knew that information.
Yeah, he knew.
The information.
Yes.
Isn't that disqualifying for the animal that was blemished?
So it should. He's right in terms of the letter of the law, but under the circumstances, he should have allowed it to slide but he didn't. He was too pious.
Was there a little arrogance in his?
No, it was the opposite. Had
A little in his deciding that fault for
No,
everything.
he was being overly humble. The Gemara, listen, the Gemara is telling me the story. The Gemara is not a book of history. The Gemara is a book that's teaching me spiritual truths. That's what its function and purpose is. Teach me spiritual truths and halacha. And one person made that decision. He made that decision. And that's why the Gemara blames him for it. Blames him for
We
it.
call it humility. Why would we call it arrogance?
Because you'll see in a minute. You'll see in a minute. Good question. Excellent question. Gemara number 8. Anyone who sets a particular place for himself to pray in the synagogue, the God of Abraham stands in his aid. And when he dies, people say to him, "This was a humble person." Limiting oneself to an appropriate space while leaving room for others is what we are looking for when we talk about humility. We're going to get to the definition of anivut in a moment. I just want to move a little quickly because I don't want to lose anyone here. I'm at 10%. Talmud Sanhedrin says as follows: there were 3 rows of disciples of the sages who sat before the judges, and each knew his proper place. If they needed to appoint another as a judge, they appointed him from the first row. And one from the second row came into the first row, and one from the third row came into the second row. And they chose another from the congregation, sent him to the third row. He did not sit in the place of the former, but he sat in the place of what was proper for him. Each person understanding their unique role is super important when it comes to understanding humility, because each person's scale of humility is going to be very different. So look at number 10. Maimonides says in the 4th chapter, in chapter 4 of the Shemona Parakim, he says as follows: humility is not the opposite of conceit, which would be self-effacement, but rather stands between conceit and self-effacement. So look at the scale. You have self-debasement, humility, pride, and arrogance. Whereas humility between these 2 places. Self-debasement would be the situation where you are completely, lowly and crushed in the corner. Pride is the exact opposite, standing with a puffed out chest and running into the like a nachshon running into the river, into the ocean. That's the place in between. That is what humility looks like. Okay, it's a balance of these 2 different expressions. So we talk about the idea of bishvili nivra ha'olam, like the world was created for me. That is pride. We talk about ani afar ve'efer, I'm nothing but the dust of the earth. That is self-debasement. Our goal is to find that place in between. As a matter of fact, the Musar masters would tell their students to have in one pocket the phrase bishvili nivra ha'olam, and in the other pocket, ani afar, I'm nothing but the dust of the earth. Because the place in the middle is what we're looking for. That's the goal. That's what we're aiming for. We're looking for that place. And anytime we see amidah in any one extreme, being overly proud or being way too low, that is a negative expression of the trait. Okay, just like chesed to an extreme is bad. You give too much to your kids, you know what you do? You destroy them. Too much to your kids, you turn them into charity cases. They have no idea how to do anything for themselves. You have to create a space where they're able to learn for themselves, grow, and develop. Rashi on this, let's look at number 11 and 12. And God said, "Let us make man in our image and our likeness." Since man, Rashi says, man is in the likeness of the angels, they would be jealous of him. For this reason, God consulted them. The proper conduct for the trait of humility, that the greater one should consult and take permission from the lesser one. Right? Meaning like, God has no need to ask anyone for anything. He's the God of the universe. But yet he asks the malachim to consult with them, to bring them up, as a way of teaching us this concept of anivut, that even God recognizes this concept of anivut, not because he needs it, because we need it. We need the lesson. We need to tell the story of anivut. It's so clear to us. By the way, this is so true for parents. How many of us, if you have kids, have seen your child about to do something which is the worst possible thing in the world? And you're like, do not do this. I am telling you, I am, right? That is probably the worst way to get your kid not to do whatever it is you think they should not be doing. The way in which you get your kid to listen to whatever eitzah you have is first by humbling yourself and recognizing, I may not know what the best thing in the world is. I do have this experience. We could think about this together, but based on my experience, I would suggest that this is a mistake. But you have to make up your own mind for yourself. That's the hardest thing in the world for a parent to do. To step back, to say something, not being definitive, but creating enough of a place where I could give over the information, share, and allow that kid to make that decision for themselves. It's the hardest thing in the world. Because who wants that? That comes with trust. There's so much there to unpack, right? But that's what we're saying, that God pulled himself back. He created a space of humility, right? So that he could allow the malachim to step up, participate, and be part of the process. And I think similarly, with our children, we got to create a process as well, where we're allowing them to feel, at the very least, feel like they're part of the process. Okay, so let's keep going. We're going to close up. We're going to wrap up in a few minutes. Gemara in Sotah, Rava, a disciple of the sages, who said, "Who possesses haughtiness of spirit deserves excommunication, and if he does not possess it, he deserves excommunication." Okay, so the story heard from a rabbi, Rabbi Avramsky. Is it true? This is a true story, by the way. Is it true that you are the greatest living legal authority in Europe? He was at a court case, and the judge asked him, "Is it true that you are the greatest Jewish legal authority in Europe?" The rabbi said, "Yeah, this is true." At that point, the judge interjected and said, "Rabbi Avramsky, is that not rather haughty of you on your part? I thought that your laws and ethics teach you to be humble." To which Rabbi Abramsky responded, "I know, but we're taught to be humble, but what can I do? I'm under oath, right? I have no choice, I gotta tell you the truth, right? I gotta tell you the truth." Now, that is humility. To know that you're humble and not being afraid to share and say that you're humble is also a form of humility, if you understand what humility is. Okay, so Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, he said that he was so humble, he didn't even know that he was humble. Right? In Orchat Tzadikim, he says, all small deeds, a small deed done in humility is 1,000 times more acceptable to God than a great deed done in pride. Well, okay, so what does humility mean? What does it mean to be humble? So to be humble means knowing when to be big and when to be small. That's why you're stuck. Like, Rabbi, make up your mind, which way are you going? Right? And I'm saying that it's a little bit of both. That part of humility is understanding that sometimes you have to stand up with pride, and sometimes you got to pull yourself back and stand in the corner and allow the things around you to happen. The midah of humility is understanding that balance, right? You're in a relationship, you can either keep your mouth shut, I'm gonna be humble, I'm not gonna say anything. No, that might not be the right response. There might be a better response might be to stand up and say something. Sometimes the right response is to be quiet, but it depends on the circumstance. It depends on the individual. It depends on the place. It depends on the time. It depends with whom. The point is that if you just take the "I'm happy where I am" approach, and I'll just keep things the status quo, I suspect that you may be making a mistake in how you're approaching some of the situations that you're in. Because some of the situations you're in require a redefining of how we understand this particular trait, the application of the trait. How do I bring this wisdom and knowledge into myself? And I'll give you in a minute, and I'll let you all respond. So, for example, let's say if you think about yourselves for a moment, and you know that you may lean more to the left on that chart, right? That you're more of the humble person who sits in the corner and rather keeps quiet versus the person who is dealing with the aspect of humility that leads to pride. So I would tell that person, work on being a bit more of the center of attention. If you generally wear very conservative, quiet clothing, make sure you're wearing something very loud for the next few weeks. Make sure that you stand up and take a position of authority, speak up. Don't allow yourself to remain in a small place. Figure out different ways of working on becoming bigger. And someone who is working on the right side of humility, who's overly proud, okay, I would tell them to work on doing the opposite. Keep your mouth shut for the next few weeks. Don't dress so extravagantly, and take a more of a backseat role in everything that's happening around you. Feel what it's like to be in each place, because the goal is balance. I don't want you to stay in one place or the other place, but I want you to understand that there's a spectrum of humility that exists, and your responsibility is to find balance within yourselves. How do you find balance within yourselves? The only way we find balance within ourselves is by working through the trait itself. And you'll see that, God willing, over the next 13 weeks, barring next week because I won't be here, I'll be in California, these traits that we're going to go through, they come up in every aspect of your lives. I spent about 14 months working on humility. And what does that mean? What does it look like? Just so you understand it. What's that? Oh, no, I never finished. No, I'm so far. I just know that I'm like the most, I have way more to go. But when I say that I worked on it, that means that I spent time journaling every single day, that I want to be more mindful of my humility. It means that I was reading pieces throughout that period that dealt specifically with humility, understanding humility, finding the stories of humility. These sheets are an expression of some of those things that I found on that journey, right? It means talking to people about humility. It means incentivizing myself to put myself in situations where I would express different extremes of humility so I could understand how it works within myself. I'm not talking about just hearing a class and okay, I got humility, I checked it off, I did it. No, that's not how this works. All this class is meant to do is to kind of like sensitize you a little bit to this idea that these traits require refinement and that they're much more profound and broader than you think. Everyone here benefits from being more humble. We are more humble. We can humble ourselves in lots of ways. For example, I don't know if I want to be the guy who stands up and runs the minyan. I'd rather be the guy that sits in the back. My nature, by the way, I'm very much an introverted person, which sounds insane because if you spend time with me, I try to be the life of the party. But I want you to know that that's not my nature. My nature is to be the quiet kid that sat in the corner. I was always the quiet kid in the corner. But I realized very, very early in my life that the quiet kids in the corners don't have fun, and I really want to have fun. So I forced myself to become a bit more, vociferous and stand up and do things that are a bit more daring because I knew that I would never get attention if I was just always in that corner.
So it's losing your ego.
It's part of it is losing your ego. I wouldn't say losing your ego. I would say it's minimizing the ego and expanding the self in the process, because the challenge is the identity, right? So you could have said, well, listen, what's wrong with being the quiet kid? Like that's who you are, that's your identity. And I'd say, no, it's okay to say I want more from the world than whatever I have. And I think that what makes Judaism, at least to me, so profound, inspirational, and unique is that it gets you to kind of like have these kinds of conversations about who you are. Are you comfortable with what you have? It's okay to want a little bit more when it comes to inner work and growth, right? Don't settle. Don't allow wherever you think you are in your life journey to determine what the future looks like, because there's so much more opportunity out there. It's not over. You have infinite possibilities, and so much of it depends on how you perceive yourselves. All I'm suggesting is that there can be a greater version of yourself that's waiting to be brought forward into the world, right? Just like Moses had. Moses not spent 40 years from his 40th birthday till his 80th birthday working on redefining himself, right? We would have never had Moses, right? His greatness, we call him an Eved Hashem. Why is he called the Eved Hashem? Not just because he served God, it's because he, on some level, recognized that God's Ratzon is the ultimate Ratzon. His will is the ultimate expression of truth. And I want to align myself with that truth. So he would much rather align every fiber of his being with God's will, and some level you could say sacrifice his life. I guarantee you he was the happiest man ever. He didn't feel like he was sacrificing anything. We're still telling his story 3,300 years later, right? He's a legend. What's that? Yeah, right. But his journey is not over, right? We don't believe it's over. We don't believe that we're in control of the results. But what are we in control of? Our efforts. Moses' story is beautiful. I think it's such a great way of ending his story. He was so passionate, so in love with the Jewish people. All he desperately wanted was to bring the Jews and God into the land of Israel together. He wanted it more than anyone could possibly imagine. But his story ends with, I couldn't get there. The greatest man, the greatest prophet, he couldn't get there. But he's still seen as a hero, right? Because we're not in control of the results. I can't control the results. I can control my attitude. I can control my character, my input. I can control my efforts. That's it. What happens next? Beyond me. May God bless you with the ability of recognizing that you are a spiritual nuclear power plant with infinite potential. And the only thing holding you back from expressing that potential is you. You could push the button whenever you want. You got to find small areas of your lives where you want to express it. But I would argue that humility is the place to begin. Why? Because depending where you fit on the scale, if you're too small, you're not going anywhere. And if you're too big, you're not going anywhere either, because you're okay, you're complete. Find that space in you that recognizes that there's room to become bigger and more, in that middle ground, and you'll see new vistas of opportunities, happiness, health, and success, and everything that you do. Because when you do that, my friends, that's how you bring God into the world. You bring God into the world by putting in effort, by strategizing, by coming up with a plan, of sensitizing, of growing. There's no growth, there's no godliness in the world. God represents potential. How do you bring it? How do you express it? That's up to you. That's what He gave you. It's called Bechira. Use it. Thank you so much for listening. God willing, we'll see you back in a couple of weeks. I'll take questions right now.